In Genesis chapter 1, who's the king and creator of all in Genesis chapter 1? Obviously God. One of the first things that God does in Genesis 1 is exert his creative authority over the darkness to contain it and create its opposite, which is light, which leads to life. So God is the one who separates darkness from light on day 1. But then on day 4, in Genesis 1, God delegates that authority to some other things in his creation. So he appoints the greater light to rule the day. Wait, I thought God rules the day. Yes. But he's choosing to do it now through a creature or a created entity. He creates a lesser light to rule the day. And so now you can say that these lights in the sky rule the day and the night. And that's not a contradiction to God's rulership. It's actually through them that he rules. Now, this is day 4, and it's setting you up for another way that God's going to delegate his rule to the humans, human power. So, and here you go, in the heavens and on the land, God appoints delegated authorities. They're also both of these entities of the skies and the land are called the hosts. The host of heaven, the hosts on the land. You have lots of later Psalms that talk about this, but check out Deuteronomy 4. The Israelites are told, hey, listen, don't lift up your eyes to the heavens and look at the sun, the moon, and the stars, the hosts of the heavens, and be led astray and worship and serve them. Let's pause right there. So, do you see, that would be the mistake, is to mistake a created thing for the creator or attribute ultimate power to one of the powers. That's the glitch in the thinking. And then look at what Moses says here about the sun, moon, and stars. They're the ones whom Yahweh your God has designated for the nations under the heavens. They worship them, but not you. Oh, okay. Well, what do you do with that one? Is that a surprise that other people worship the sun, moon, and stars? That's actually a pretty universal phenomenon in a lot of human history. So Israel is presented as a people group who are being chosen to be out from under the authority of those powers and under the direct power and authority of the Creator. In fact, Moses says as much in Deuteronomy 32. Moses says, hey, Israelites, remember the days of old. Consider the years past. Ask your dad. He'll give you wisdom. Ask your elders, and they'll tell you. Not so much in America, but in most sane cultures, in most of human history, this is how things work. When the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided up humanity. So let's pause right there. He's recalling something from earlier in the Torah. When did God assign people where they live and divide up? Can you think of that biblical story or passage? It's Babylon. Yeah. And then Genesis 10, the table of 70 nations, their languages, where they live. So the dividing up of the nations is under God's authority, but the scattering happened. It was God's response to an act of rebellion, wasn't it? An act of rebellion and of earthly powers that want to ascend to the heavens by making their own tower. So Babylon itself is a moment of the powers trying to ascend back to the place where they've been exiled from, where heaven and earth overlap. And so this scattering is one of these merciful acts of judgment, just like the exile from the garden. So remember that story when he gave the nations their inheritance. He divided humanity. He fixed the borders of the people according to the number of the sons of God. Oh, well, that's interesting. Who are the sons of God? In Hebrew, you can say the phrase sons of or also daughters of, and you're not talking about like birth parents or birth descendants. It's a phrase. It means members of X class. An easy one is Elijah and Elisha had a crew always following them around. Remember what they're called? Sons of the prophets. Yeah. Elijah and Elisha did not have hundreds of kids. It's their disciples, prophets in training. People who are also in the class of prophet. So our phrase, sons of Elohim, Elohim is the Hebrew word for spiritual being. So these are spiritual beings. That's what they are. They're spiritual beings. Do I have a category for spiritual beings who have been delegated to rule? Yes, they're called the hosts of heaven. And I was given real concrete examples of them in Genesis 1, the sun, moon, and stars. And I know that can go wrong because those beings can begin to attract worship that detracts from the honor to the Creator. And so what Moses is saying here is that when God scattered the nations at Babylon, he handed them over, so to speak, to the powers. But he chose, predestined, all that language, he chose one particular family that he was going to rule over directly to begin the new humanity project. And he calls this, the Lord's portion is his people. Jacob is his allotted heritage. Is this striking you as pretty significant for understanding the biblical storyline? Like, this is super significant. So, in other words, the narrative in Genesis is 10 verses about Babylon. What you're going to come across is moments in the biblical story that keep filling out what exactly happened at Babylon. And this is one of them. There are rebel spiritual beings who didn't remain loyal to God, just like there are rebel humans who don't remain loyal to God. And here's what's hard for me still, is that these are beings in a way that is different from how I am a being. I'm, the sun, moon, and stars. I'm not a burning plasma ball in outer space, But I'm also not whatever authority a stop sign has over us all, that's an entity, a created entity that exists in relation to human beings, but is not a human being. Where's the human being who represents the authority of the stop sign? It's another kind of created entity, isn't it? And it seems to me this is what Paul's getting at. The powers can cover lots of different things. It can cover a spiritual being who is like unto me, like a personal type of being, and he reserves the language of the accuser, the devil, or the Satan, or the language of the demons, lesser spiritual beings. But he can also use the powers to refer to what we would say are abstract entities. But for him, they're all part of one package deal. So in a polytheistic culture, think of what the gods are. They're what Westerners call nature. Sun, moon, and stars, fertility, the power of fertility, sex gods. The power, and fertility gods aren't just created to humans, but the fertility of your flocks, the fertility, rivers, sources of life, war, military valor. There was the Roman goddess Roma, the power of the state, deified as a goddess. And the statues of these Roman gods look exactly like the statues that you see when you go into modern capitals here today. And we give them abstract names, justice, liberty. There's not a lot of difference between us and people 2,000 years ago, except we don't slaughter chickens. Some people don't slaughter chickens to them, but instead we just slaughter each other. There's very little difference between us and the people that Paul was writing to. We just think we're more sophisticated. The powers, that's what we're talking about here. Let me just throw one other example at you, and then we'll process. In the story of the this is good. In the story of the Exodus, Moses, Pharaoh, right, Egypt, let my people go. Who's the bad guy? Who's the bad guy? Pharaoh. Very clearly in the foreground as the bad guy. In the Passover, the first description of Passover, this is Exodus chapter 12, verse 12. God tells Moses, I'm going to pass through the land of Egypt that night and strike all the firstborn of Egypt, human and beast, and on all the gods of Egypt I will execute acts of judgment. Who is being struck by the 10th plague? The human powers and the spiritual powers. They're not different. And what this line, for sure, being revealed in the 10th plague, is it makes you go back and think through all of the earlier plagues in Egypt. Here, this one's for free. Chapter 10, verse 21, the plague of darkness. The Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand toward the sky and let there be darkness. Let there be darkness. Does this ring any bells? Yes, it's the exact reversal of Genesis 1:3. Let there be light. Let there be darkness. Whom did God appoint to rule on his behalf over the darkness and the light? The powers. The powers. So God's exerting his influence, his authority and influence over the rebel powers. So who's the chief god of the Egyptian pantheon? It's Ra, the sun god. So this is all connected. The gods of the powers of Egypt are being judged as he brings down the human powers of Egypt. It's always two-sided. Always two-sided for Paul. So we could spend a lot more time. The handout goes into a lot more detail, but I think you at least get the gist of the picture here. And so this is why, for Paul, when the one family of Abraham is freed from slavery to the powers, it creates a humanity in which there is no, think of it, no male or female, no slave or free, no Scythian, barbarian, Greek, or Jew. I mean, he's covering the whole class there. Peoples whose identities and destinies are not governed by the powers. Nothing can separate us from the love of the Messiah. Even if they kill you, all they can do is kill you. And that will be you participating in the triumph over the powers, because all they can do is kill you. Where, of course, the actual ruling king has power over life and death itself. Okay, this is remarkable to me. I still am reckoning with the fact that I've been following Jesus for almost 20 years, and this is just now becoming clear to me. But this is a version of the biblical story that is simultaneously spiritual and political and social. It's just saying all of those things are one. But I think it makes sense of why Paul says the things that he says. And all the way back to Lauren's great question from this morning, talk about a diagnosis of the human condition that can speak to any culture, any age, in the present. And that gives God's people leverage to both be a source of good, but also be a prophetic voice to expose the corruption of the powers